name is Beatrice Eleanor Vance, though I was born Beatrice Eleanor Sterling. I was born on the 9th of November in the year 1845 in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I am now 82 years old. I reside in a spacious gas-lit home on Rittenhouse Square, attended by servants who walk softly upon imported Persian rugs. I have lived to see the skies conquered by flying machines and the streets paved for automobiles, leaving the horse-drawn carriages of my youth to the dust of memory. I am widely regarded by my peers as a woman of impeccable breeding, profound piety, and unshakable moral fortitude. I have spent decades serving on the boards of charitable institutions and funding orphanages. But all of my philanthropy, all of my socially lauded good works are nothing but a frantic, futile attempt to scrub the blood from my own hands. I'm not a good woman. I'm a warden who wore silk dresses, and my wealth was built directly upon the agonizing, buried screams of my younger sister. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of my cowardice, you must first understand the suffocating nature of a wealthy mid-19th century household and the fragile, perilous position of women within it. The Sterling family was a monument to industrial success and social rigidity. My father, Silas Sterling, was a railroad magnate, a man whose heart was as cold and unyielding as the iron tracks that generated his fortune. He viewed his family not as a sanctuary of affection, but as a corporate holding that required strict management and absolute submission. My mother, a pale, nervous woman who suffered from perpetual ailments, faded into the background of our grand, terrifying house, leaving her daughters entirely to the mercy of my father's dictatorial will. There were only two of us, myself, the eldest, and my sister Florence, born 3 years later in 1848. We were raised in an environment where appearance was the only currency that mattered. From the time we were old enough to wear corsets, we were taught that a woman possessed no inherent value beyond her ability to reflect well upon the men who owned her, first her father and eventually her husband. Any display of strong emotion, any deviation from the quiet, demure ideal of Victorian womanhood was treated not merely as a flaw, but as a dangerous disease that required immediate, harsh correction. I absorbed these lessons perfectly. I was a naturally timid child, terrified of my father's booming voice and the heavy oak cane he struck against the floorboards when displeased. I learned to make myself small, to speak only when spoken to, and to bury any dissenting thought deep within the dark recesses of my mind. I became the perfect, hollowed-out porcelain doll my father required. But Florence was different. Florence was a creature of fire and raw, unfiltered passion, born into a world made entirely of dry tinder and glass. She had wild, curling dark hair that refused to be tamed by pins, and eyes that blazed with an intelligence and a hunger that frightened me even when we were young. She loved music, not the polite parlor pieces we were instructed to play, but complex, thunderous compositions that she would pound out on the grand piano when our father was away. She read voraciously, sneaking volumes of poetry and philosophy from the locked glass cabinets in the library. While I accepted our gilded cage, Florence battered her wings against the bars until she bled. When we were children, I loved her for her courage. I would sit on the edge of her bed late at night, listening with wide-eyed terror and secret thrill as she whispered about her dreams of traveling to Europe, of becoming a writer, of living a life that belonged entirely to her. She was my vibrant, a beautiful secret. But as we transitioned into the perilous years of young womanhood, my admiration slowly mutated into a deep, pervasive anxiety. In the society of 1860s Philadelphia, a spirited, fiercely independent woman was not an inspiration. She was a profound liability. The onset of the Civil War brought chaos to the nation, but it brought an entirely different kind of war to the Sterling household. In 1863, when I was 18 and Florence was 15, my father began the process of arranging my marriage. He selected Edward Vance, a man 12 years my senior, who was a junior partner in a prestigious banking firm. Edward was a man carved from the exact same unyielding stone as my father. He was cold, ruthlessly ambitious, and obsessed with social propriety. I did not love him. I was terrified of his stern, judgmental gaze, but I accepted his proposal with submissive gratitude, because I knew that refusing my father would invite a wrath I could not endure. I was married in the winter of 1864, moving into Edward's immaculate, joyless townhouse, trading one authoritarian master for another. With my departure, the full, unbearable weight of my father's oppressive rule fell squarely upon Florence. Deprived of my mitigating, buffering presence, her rebellions escalated from secret reading and improper music to open defiance. When she was 18, she committed the ultimate, unpardonable sin against our father's pride. She refused a highly advantageous marriage proposal from a wealthy, aging textile mill owner. She did not simply decline politely. She stood in my father's study, trembling but resolute, and declared she would rather drown in the Schuylkill River than tether herself to a man she found repulsive. The fallout was catastrophic. My father, unaccustomed to the slightest contradiction, flew into a rage that shook the very foundations of the house. He locked Florence in her bedchamber for 2 weeks, feeding her only bread and water, attempting to break her will through isolation and starvation. I visited the house during this time, sitting in the parlor with my nervous, weeping mother, listening to the muffled sounds of Florence weeping and throwing her belongings against the locked door. I could have intervened. I could have begged my husband, Edward, to allow Florence to come live with us. But Edward despised Florence, viewing her as an erratic, improper influence that threatened the immaculate reputation he was building. And I, paralyzed by my lifelong habit of cowardice, sat perfectly still in my velvet chair, sipping tea, and did absolutely nothing to help the sister who had once been my entire world. The isolation did not break Florence's will. It shattered her obedience into 1,000 jagged, unpredictable pieces. When my father finally unlocked her door after 2 agonizing weeks, she emerged not as a chastened daughter, but as a woman completely untethered from the expectations of our world. She refused to wear the restrictive corsets my mother laid out for her, wandering the grand, silent halls of our home in loose cotton wrappers. She ceased attending the Sunday services at our Episcopalian church, an act of public defiance that caused whispers to ripple through our elite social circle. Most terrifyingly to my father, she began to speak her mind with a raw, bleeding honesty. When his business associates visited for dinner, she would stand at the top of the sweeping mahogany staircase and shout down at them, accusing my father of tyranny, of crushing the life out of his own family just as ruthlessly as he crushed the laborers on his railroads. In the rigid, patriarchal society of the 1860s, a woman who displayed such vehement, unvarnished anger was not considered oppressed. She was considered medically insane. The medical establishment of the time was entirely complicit in the subjugation of women. Conditions like hysteria and moral insanity were convenient, legally sanctioned labels applied to any female who refused to submit to male authority. My father, realizing that he could not beat Florence into submission without causing a scandalous public spectacle that would damage his precious reputation, chose the physician's pen over his oak cane. It was a cleaner, more respectable method of execution. In the autumn of 1866, when Florence was a mere 18 years old, my father summoned a prominent Philadelphia alienist, a specialist in diseases of the mind, to our family home. I was summoned as well. My husband, Edward, drove me to the house in our enclosed carriage, his face set in a mask of grim disapproval. As the horses clopped over the cobblestones, Edward took my gloved hand. He did not squeeze it with affection. He held it in a vice-like grip that bruised my knuckles through the fabric. "Your sister is a diseased, hysterical woman," he said softly, his voice leaving absolutely no room for dissent. "She is a blight on the Sterling name, and by extension the Vance name. Your father has found a solution. You will not interfere, Beatrice. You will support his decision, or you will find yourself no longer welcome in my home." The threat was absolute. And I was 21 years old, completely dependent on Edward for my social standing, my financial survival, and my very identity. If he cast me out, I would be nothing. Worse than nothing. I would be a ruined, discarded woman with no means to support herself. The profound, suffocating cowardice that had defined my entire existence rose up and swallowed whatever meager scraps of sisterly devotion I still possessed. I was led into my father's dark, wood-paneled study. The alienist, a man with cold, assessing eyes and a meticulously trimmed beard, sat behind the heavy desk. My father stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid and commanding. They did not bring Florence into the room. They did not need to. The diagnosis had already been purchased with my father's immense wealth. They merely required the formal corroboration of a female relative to satisfy the legal requirements of the commitment papers. The doctor looked at me, his pen poised over a thick cream-colored document. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his tone unctuous and patronizing, "your father has detailed the tragic decline of your sister's mental faculties. He describes fits of unnatural rage, a dangerous aversion to her familial duties, and a complete collapse of her moral reasoning. As her elder sister, can you attest to these disturbing behavioral aberrations?" The silence in the study was absolute. The heavy pendulum of the grandfather clock in the corner ticked with the deafening rhythm of a heartbeat. I thought of Florence. I thought of her teaching me to play a waltz on the piano when our parents were away, her laughter filling the suffocating house with sudden, brilliant light. I knew, with the absolute agonizing clarity of truth, that my sister was not insane. She was desperate. She was a trapped animal thrashing against a snare. suffocating in a world that demanded she be silent and still. She was simply everything I was too terrified to be. I looked at my father, whose eyes bored into me, silently daring me to speak the truth and face his annihilation. I looked at Edward, standing by the door, his posture rigid, a silent reminder of the threat he had issued in the carriage. I felt the heavy silk of my expensive gown, the weight of the diamond rings on my fingers. I weighed my sister's entire life, her freedom and her brilliant mind, against my own comfortable, gilded prison. Yes, I whispered. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Please speak up, Mrs. Vance, the doctor prompted gently, dipping his steel pen into the glass inkwell. Yes, I said, my voice louder now, perfectly steady, stripping the last vestige of humanity from my own soul. My sister is deeply unwell. She is given to violent hysterics and delusions. She is a danger to herself and to the peace of this household. She requires confinement. The doctor nodded, a satisfied, highly professional gesture. He pushed the paper across the mahogany desk and handed me the pen. I took it. My hand did not shake. I signed my name, Beatrice Eleanor Vance, executing my own sister with a flourish of black ink. I condemned an 18-year-old girl to a living death so that I could return to my quiet townhouse, host dinner parties, and drink tea from delicate porcelain cups without the burden of Edward's displeasure. I laid the steel pen back upon the mahogany desk. The sound of the nib clicking against the glass inkwell echoed in the silent study like the sharp crack of a breaking bone. It was done. The transaction of my sister's life was complete. I was dismissed from the room, sent back to my husband's carriage like a child who had correctly recited a difficult lesson. I rode back to my townhouse in complete silence, staring blindly out the window at the gray Philadelphia streets, feeling as though I had just swallowed a stone that would never, ever pass through my body. They came for Florence 2 mornings later. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday in November. I had returned to my parents' house under the strict orders of my father to maintain an appearance of familial normalcy during the removal. I stood in the grand foyer, flanked by my weeping mother and my father, whose face was a mask of furious righteous granite. Outside, a heavy, unmarked carriage pulled by 2 black horses waited at the bottom of the front steps. 2 men, built like laborers and wearing thick wool coats, entered our home with heavy, deliberate steps. They did not go to Florence's room with the gentle bedside manner of physicians. They went as wardens. I heard the muffled shouting from the 2nd floor, the sound of a struggle, the crash of a porcelain wash basin shattering against the hardwood. And then I heard the screaming. It was not the scream of a madwoman. It was the raw, terrifying shriek of a girl who realizes she is being buried alive. They dragged her to the top of the sweeping mahogany staircase. Florence was barefoot, wearing only her thin white nightdress, her dark hair falling in a tangled mass around her face. One man had her by the arms, the other by the waist. She fought them with a desperate, animalistic ferocity, kicking and twisting, her bare feet bleeding where she had stepped on the broken porcelain. Then she looked down into the foyer. She saw her father, standing rigid and unyielding. And then her wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine. "Beatrice!" she screamed, her voice tearing at her throat, echoing off the high plaster ceilings. "Beatrice, help me! Tell them. Tell them I'm not mad. Please, Bea. Don't let them take me. I stood frozen. My hands were clasped so tightly together in front of my expensive silk dress that my knuckles were entirely white. I could not breathe. I could not move. Florence stopped struggling for a fraction of a second, staring into my face. She was looking for her older sister. She was looking for the girl who had sat on the edge of her bed and listened to her dreams, but she did not find her. She saw only the blank, terrified mask of Mrs. Edward Vance. In that single agonizing heartbeat, Florence realized the truth. She realized that I had known. She realized that I had signed the paper. Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never be on YouTube. These are the voices too personal, that too raw to share publicly, completely unedited, nothing cut. If you want access, the link is in the description. It's called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us keep making these videos. All right, back to the story. The look of pure, unadulterated betrayal that washed over my sister's face is an image that has been burned into the retinas of my eyes for 60 years. It was a look that stripped away every lie, every justification I had tried to tell myself. She stopped screaming my name. Her face twisted into a mask of absolute devastating hatred. As the men dragged her down the stairs, her heels dragging violently against the carpet, she did not plead with me again. She simply stared at me, her eyes dark and hollow, until they hauled her out the heavy front doors and threw her into the waiting carriage. The heavy doors slammed shut. The carriage rolled away, taking the brightest soul I had ever known to the Fairview Asylum, a bleak fortress of stone 20 miles outside the city limits. The silence that descended upon the house after she was gone was absolute and suffocating. My father turned to my mother, his voice perfectly calm. "Instruct the servants to clear out her room. I do not want to see a single trace of her remaining in this house by evening." And that was the end of it. Florence Sterling was erased from existence. The narrative was swiftly manufactured and deployed to our social circle. Florence had suffered a complete collapse of the nerves. She was of a delicate constitution, my father explained to his associates, and had been sent to an exclusive sanatorium in the countryside to take the rest cure. The society matrons murmured polite sympathies, perfectly content to accept the lie because it maintained the polished veneer of our collective reality. It was considered vulgar to ask for details, and so no one ever did. I returned to my life with Edward. I returned to hosting dinner parties, attending the opera, and overseeing the household staff. But I was a walking corpse. Every time I lay in my soft feather bed listening to the rain beat against the window panes, I was not in Philadelphia. I was 20 miles away, in a freezing, damp cell of cut stone. I knew what happened in those places. Everyone knew, though we never spoke of it in polite company. I knew about the ice water baths used to shock patients into submission. I knew about the heavy leather restraints, the forced feedings, the doses of laudanum and chloral hydrate used to keep the inmates in a state of perpetual, foggy compliance. I knew about the isolation, the screams echoing down the long, dark corridors in the middle of the night. I had condemned my sister, my brilliant, passionate, entirely sane sister, to a house of unimaginable horrors. The guilt became a physical entity, a parasite that fed upon my organs. I lost my appetite, pushing expensive cuts of meat around my porcelain plate while Edward glared at me from the opposite end of the dining table. I woke up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, convinced that I could hear Florence scratching at the inside of the walls, begging to be let out. Edward viewed my decline not with concern, but with a cold, rising irritation. I was becoming an inconvenience. He warned me, in his soft, lethal voice, that if I did not master my melancholic humors, he would be forced to consult a physician for my own good. The threat was clear. If I did not stop grieving the sister I had buried alive, he would bury me right next to her. The threat was clear. If I did not stop grieving the sister I had buried alive, he would bury me right next to her. And so, the ultimate act of my cowardice was completed. I learned to swallow my horror. I became the perfect empty vessel Edward required. I wore the latest fashions imported from Paris. I hosted the charity balls for the poor, an irony so bitter it burned my throat. And I gave birth to 2 children, a boy and a girl, who were raised by strict nurses and governesses because I was too terrified to attach my soul to anything I could lose. I survived by methodically killing the part of me that was Beatrice Sterling, until I was entirely, hollowly Mrs. Edward Vance. The decades bled into one another with the slow, agonizing drip of a water clock. The 1870s gave way to the 1880s. My father died of a sudden apoplexy in his study in 1878, collapsing onto the very mahogany desk where he had signed Florence's life away. My mother followed him to the grave a year later, fading into the wallpaper of that grand, terrible house until her heart simply ceased to beat. Edward absorbed my father's empire, consolidating the Sterling and Vance fortunes. He became richer, colder, and more untouchable. During those long, suffocating years, I tried to send letters to Fairview Asylum. I bribed a sympathetic maid to post them in secret, begging the administrators for news of my sister. I asked if she was warm, if she was permitted to read, if she was well. The replies I received were always brief, typed on cold institutional letterhead and signed by the chief alienist. Miss Sterling remains prone to melancholia and disruptive outbursts, the letters would state. Visitors are strictly prohibited, as they agitate her fragile nerves and disrupt the therapeutic environment. They were keeping her a prisoner. I knew it. But as long as Edward was alive, holding the absolute legal and financial power over my existence, I was a prisoner too. In the winter of 1892, when I was 47 years old and Florence had been locked away for 26 agonizing years, Edward's heart finally failed him. He died in his sleep, his face as rigid and unyielding in death as it had been in life. He left me a widow of staggering, almost incomprehensible wealth. The iron grip that had choked the breath from my lungs for 3 decades was instantly, miraculously gone. I was, for the first time in my entire life, the absolute master of my own fate. I did not wait for the formal mourning period to end. I did not care about the whispers of society. 3 weeks after Edward was placed in the family mausoleum, I ordered my carriage. I wore my heaviest black widow's weeds, a thick crepe veil obscuring my face, and I instructed my driver to take me the 20 miles to Fairview Asylum. The journey took hours over rutted, frozen roads. Every jolt of the carriage rattled my bones, my stomach churning with a violent mixture of desperate, foolish hope and paralyzing terror. I told myself that with my newfound wealth I could bring her home. I could hire private nurses. I could buy her a house by the sea. I could spend the rest of my life making amends for what I had done to her when we were girls. Fairview Asylum emerged from the bleak winter landscape like a monstrous, soot-stained beast. It was a sprawling structure of dark granite, surrounded by high iron fences and devoid of any softening greenery. It looked like a fortress designed not to keep the world out, but to keep the damned securely inside. I swept into the main building, demanding to see the chief administrator. My name, backed by the immense weight of the Vance fortune, opened doors that were securely sealed to ordinary families. I was ushered into a sterile, harsh office that smelled overwhelmingly of carbolic acid and boiled cabbage. The administrator, a younger man who had not been there when my father first committed Florence, looked at the heavy file on his desk with a strange, detached pity. He tried to dissuade me from seeing her. He told me the years had not been kind to Miss Sterling. He spoke of institutional decline, a sterile, cowardly medical phrase meant to disguise the systematic destruction of a human mind. He warned me that she might not recognize me, that her faculties had degraded significantly. But I was no longer the terrified 21-year-old girl standing in my father's study. I was a wealthy, powerful widow who had survived Edward Vance. I slammed my gloved hand onto his desk and told him that if he did not take me to my sister immediately, I would buy the asylum and have him removed from his position before nightfall. He yielded. He led me out of his office and down into the bowels of the institution. The sounds of Fairview are something I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die. As we walked down the long, freezing corridors, I heard the hollow, rhythmic thud of heads banging against plastered walls. I heard the sharp, authoritative barks of the ward attendants and the desperate, nonsensical weeping of women who had been entirely forgotten by the world. The air was thick, unbreathable, smelling of unwashed bodies in despair. We climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, the ward reserved for the chronic, incurable cases. We walked down a dimly lit hallway until we stopped before a heavy wooden door with a small, barred viewing window. The administrator pulled a heavy iron key from his ring. It clanked into the lock with a terrible final echo. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped aside. I walked into the cell. The cell was no larger than a horse's stall, illuminated only by a single narrow window set high into the thick stone wall, barred with heavy iron. The air inside was freezing, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of old blood, unwashed linen, and the bitter chemical sting of lye. There was no furniture save for a narrow iron cot bolted to the floor, upon which lay a thin-stained mattress. And sitting in the center of that mattress, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, rocking in a slow, hypnotic, endless rhythm, was a woman. She was 44 years old, but the creature before me looked ancient. Her beautiful, wild dark hair had been shorn violently close to her scalp, likely to prevent lice, and what remained was entirely, shockingly white. She wore a coarse, shapeless gray institutional gown that hung off her emaciated frame like a shroud on a skeleton. The hands that had once pounded out magnificent, thunderous sonatas on the grand piano were now curled inward, trembling constantly. The wrists scarred with thick, white bands of raised tissue from decades of leather restraints. "Florence?" I whispered. The name felt foreign on my tongue. I had not spoken it aloud in 26 years. She did not stop rocking. She did not look up. Her gaze was fixed entirely on a blank patch of the stone floor, her pale, sunken eyes entirely devoid of light. The fire, the brilliant, terrifying, beautiful fire that had once defined my sister, had been completely, systematically extinguished. There were not even embers remaining. I took a step forward, the rustle of my heavy silk morning dress sounding obscenely loud in the barren cell. I sank to my knees on the freezing stone floor, disregarding the dampness that seeped through my skirts. I reached out a trembling hand, covered in black kid leather, and gently touched her shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. Florence flinched so violently she threw herself backward against the stone wall, curling into a tight, defensive ball. She threw her scarred arms over her head, shielding her face as if expecting a blow, and began to whimper. It was not the weeping of a woman. It was the high-pitched, mindless keen of a terrified animal. "I am quiet," she babbled rapidly, her voice a harsh, unused rasp that bore no resemblance to the sister I knew. "I am quiet, sir. I am a good girl. No cold water. Please, no cold water. I am quiet." My heart did not just break. It was obliterated. The sheer, overwhelming horror of what I had done crashed down upon me with the weight of a collapsing building. I tore the black crepe veil from my face and reached for her again, tears streaming down my cheeks, sobbing with an agonizing, breathless grief. "Florence, it is Bea," I choked out, trying to catch her flailing, desperate hands. "It is Beatrice. I am so sorry. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. Edward is dead. Father is dead. I have come to take you home. You are free, Florence. You are free." She peeked at me through her fingers. For a single suspended second, I prayed for a spark of recognition. I prayed that beneath the ruin, my sister was still there, waiting to be rescued. But her pale eyes moved over my face with absolute blank incomprehension. She did not know my name. She did not know her own. The asylum had not merely broken her spirit. It had dissolved her entire mind. She began to rock again, faster now, burying her face in her knees, humming a discordant, tuneless note to drown out the sound of my weeping. I used my staggering fortune to buy her release that very afternoon. I didn't take her back to Philadelphia, for the noise and the crowds would have terrified her. I purchased a secluded, sprawling estate on the coast of Maine, surrounded by acres of quiet pine forests and looking out over the gray, rolling ocean. I hired the finest private physicians, gentle-handed nurses, and dedicated companions. I clothed her in the softest silks and fed her the richest foods. I filled the house with music, buying a magnificent grand piano, hoping the notes would unlock the prison of her mind. But you cannot buy back a murdered soul. Florence lived at the estate in Maine for 8 years before her ruined body finally gave out. In all that time, she never spoke a coherent sentence. She never touched the keys of the piano. She spent her days sitting by the large glass windows, staring out at the ocean with vacant, unseeing eyes, incessantly picking at the threads of her expensive gowns. If a door closed too loudly, she would dive beneath the furniture, weeping and begging not to be put in the ice bath. I lived with her, abandoning my social life, watching the phantom I had created slowly fade away. When she died in the winter of 1900, she slipped away in her sleep, as quietly and unobtrusively as the asylum had trained her to be. I am 82 years old now. I sit in my grand house on Rittenhouse Square, surrounded by the hollow trappings of my immense wealth. The society papers call me a great philanthropist. They praise my generous donations to the newly established hospitals for women, my endowments to universities, my tireless charity work. They look at my white hair and my severe, respectable black gowns, and they see a paragon of Victorian virtue. But they do not know that my charity is nothing but a desperate, frantic bribe offered to a god who stopped listening to me the day I picked up that steel pen in my father's study. They do not know that the Vance fortune is soaked through with the blood and the stolen years of a brilliant 18-year-old girl. I have survived my father. I have survived my husband. I have survived the sister I betrayed. But I have not survived myself. I have spent the last 60 years living in a prison of my own cowardice. A prison with walls far thicker and more unyielding than the stone blocks of Fairview Asylum. I chose my own comfort over my sister's life. I chose the approval of cruel men over the truth. When my heart finally stops beating, I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve peace. I only hope that wherever my soul is sent, Florence is not there to see me burn. She has suffered enough. That is the truth of Beatrice Eleanor Vance. I was a good wife, a dutiful daughter, and a respected woman of society. And I was the monster who locked her sister in the dark and threw away the key,